So slow. So slow. Okay, I think we've got it dealt with there. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where in the world you might be. I'm Tad. It's cold in the basement today. It is cold. Don't ask me why. Not basement, it's just the downstairs. But anyway, it's cold. That's why I'm wearing a sweat. A hoodie, whatever you want to call it. Is it a hoodie if it zips up the front? That's always a little unclear to me. Anyway, so good to see you all. Tad Williams, writer, reading very soon. Trying to think if there was anything else particularly I wanted to say. Maybe. Let me say hello to people first, and then I will see if there's anything else I needed to talk about. I see Jerry's there. Hello, Jerry. And Dawn. Hello, Dawn. And Greg and Nancy. Hello. Kelly, good to see you. Evening. Emily, good evening. Becca, good to see you too. Barban, hi. Jared, hello. Kenneth, hello. Carl, yeah, the week was pretty good. Thank you. Annie, hi, Annie. I certainly will give Johnny a big hug. He's struggling along, but Felina, nice to see you. Jeremy, write any good books today? Wrote a little tiny bit of what I hope will be a good book today. Alexis, what's up? Hey, how you? Are you home yet? Well, we'll find out. If not, I hope you're home soon. Claudia, hello, hiya, good to see you. Ken, for a guy who's on live, you're not saying much. Oh, that's, yeah, at the very beginning, because what I'm always doing at the beginning is I'm posting URLs to my other social media sites. And because of the way that Google Chrome, oh God, can you hear? Oh, now he stopped. There. I don't know if you can hear that. That is an extremely overexcited rescue chihuahua upstairs who I suspect is getting fed. Anyway, Ken, so yeah, no, at the beginning of the reading every time, what I have to do is I have to actually start the live broadcast. And it's only when I start the live broadcast that I can get an actual URL, because until the broadcast begins, the URL doesn't exist. And then it gives me a URL, and then I can put that URL onto my other social media as well. So people can join directly from there. So that's why you see me sitting around at the beginning going, but I'm doing things. And I'm also using my laptop instead of my regular keyboard, so it takes me a little bit longer. Anyway, so that's what's going on. I know it's probably kind of weird looking, and you'll often hear me muttering to myself or occasionally whistling or singing, because I forget that there's people actually, because I can't see, I'm looking at another browser, so I can't see what's on the screen, so I'm probably going making all kinds of weird faces. Anyway, so now you know, Ken, and knowing is half the battle. Medardo, la non mazza dueñas. Hello, good to see you. Mark, hi Mark, good to see you too. It was lovely to be able to spend some time with you at the memorial service last week. A real pleasure. Well, as much as a pleasure as it can be under the circumstances, I should say. But anyway, yes. Paul steps in. Wow, that's a surprise to see you there. I thought you had real important things to do instead of hanging out with me. Paul says, yes, still a hoodie. And who else is there? Jeremy. Hi, Jeremy. And Corey. Hi, Corey. And Regina. Hello, Regina. You are home, Alexis. Oh, that's excellent. Okay, good. Becca. Yeah, that's Walter is he's actually a lovely little dog. I think I was talking about him last week. He's a rescue. He's small now. He's like 4 pounds, maybe. He's a little deer-headed Chihuahua. He looks a lot like a miniature pincher. He's got the same coloring, the same upright ears, very slender, and all that. But when we got him, and he had just been living on the street for a year, and then had been being not passed around, but he had had to have a couple of different operations when he was brought in, et cetera, et cetera. And by the time we got him, he was like 2 pounds. We have pictures of him. He really looks like a rat. He just was the tiniest, skinniest little thing. So he's still very food conscious all these years later, and very shrieky when something is exciting him or making him nervous. God forbid, even his closest family and pack members, should somebody put on a hat or otherwise change their profile, the alarm bells go off. He's up, running around on the floor, barking, yip, 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 danger, disaster, he's very cautious. Fortunately, he doesn't do it all the time, because otherwise, we would have had to put him in a t-shirt cannon and fire him over to the neighbors' yards or something. But he can be very noisy. Anyway, so Ken, yes, that's the small monster in the background. Lisa, hi, good to see you. Alexis, yeah, small monster, exactly. And Felina also is big on barking at dinner time, so right on for that. Hi, Sean, good to see you. That's Sean, editor and writer, very fine guy, and with a splendid haircut, I have to say. Sean has always had a splendid haircut. And that's basically what's going on. As I did mention, it's a bit cold down here, which is kind of... Oh, Matthew! Hello, Matt. This is my Matthew here, who's in the comment section, is our agent, and also an extremely talented guy in his own right. A poet, a photographer, a painter, and fortunately for me, also my agent and friend. Anyway, so anything else to talk about? It's just been one of those, another one of those weeks. The only thing I really have to talk about is to ask those of you, hi Jim, ask those of you who will be tuning in next week for the 2 readings to check in with me on social media. There's a slim possibility, because somebody that I love very much is having a birthday on next Sunday. And that somebody is me. I may have to change the schedule around, because I have no idea if, what we're doing here or anything. I think it will probably stay the same, I think. But it may have to change the time of the evening reading or something, if that's the only time the family can, order dinner or whatever the case may be. So anyway, so that's the only piece of news, which is to stay in touch with what's happening on the social media pages. Or, just check in at some point and see. And I will try to mention it well ahead of time if there's any changes to the schedule. So, what else? Anything else? Not really. As I said, we're just working. We're hanging out, we're doing stuff. Dogs are dogging, people are peopling. And Deb and I are just trying to hold it all together, because that's our job, is steering the ship of family through the tempest of pandemic. That's pretty much it. So fortunately, we haven't had to keel haul anybody yet. We haven't had to inflict maritime discipline on any of them. They're all being pretty darn good cohabitants. So anyway, that's where we're at. I don't really have much to report this week. I'm working on my books. And so what I'm going to do instead is, well, not instead, because I've still taken up almost 10 minutes babbling. What I'm going to do instead is start reading. We are getting down, as you can see, by where the bookmark is, we're getting down to the very end of War of the Flowers. And we really only have a chapter and a half left. I don't know if I'm going to finish it tonight. If it's close, I'll just go over and finish it. But if not, or, if I'm having coughing fits or cat dander sneezing fits or something, I may have to cut out early. Actually, it's a pretty long, I don't know if I'm going to finish tonight. It's hard to judge these things. Some bits take you longer to read than others. Okay, so that's what's going on. I know it should seem like I know what I'm doing by now, at least in this very small arena, but of course I don't. I just kind of make these things up as I go. And unfortunately, it's probably too late to start doing anything different now. Oh my God, there's a picture of me in the back. That's horrifying. Yeah, don't want to see that. Okay, so what has happened is that Theo and Cumber and Applecore have all been taken to the site of the first mound, which is essentially the spot of Fairyland. It's where the king and queen, who are not dead, but in a sense are kind of in suspended animation, are still to be found, and it's where Hellebore, along with his terrible child, who is Theo's human doppelganger, where Hellebore intends to perform his ceremony, where they are going to steal from our world to replenish the power of fairy. And Theo has been trying to resist, because of his violet flower family ancestry, is the sort of the other key, like the nuclear missile things where two people have to turn the key. An old deal that was made in fairy said one Hellebore and one Violet had to make the decision to do this particular thing. And so Theo is actually one of the Violet clan, but he's doing it, of course, against his will. The terrible child, his the actual mortal child that was stolen from Theo's supposed parents, has been trying to take this away from him, to take this out of him and open this gateway that will allow this complicated passage of energy from our world to the Fairyland world and plunge our world into chaos. And during the course of that, though, just as things are almost over, Theo has noticed the Ira, which is this nasty, dangerous spirit that has been following him since the very beginning of the book, has finally found him on this island and has walked across under the water, this shambling, crumbling thing that once was a fairyland body of a constable, a police officer, and is kind of falling apart now because the Ira doesn't care about any of that stuff, and the thing it's moving around is a dead body. So anyway, so that's where we are. They're on the mound, on the island, and the Ira is coming. And where do we want to start? Okay. So Applecore has just attacked Hellebore to distract him. And then Hellebore has just backhanded her away, and then set her on fire, or appears to have set her on fire. So all this is happening at the same time, and the spell is almost completed, and the shambling Ira is coming up the slope of the island toward them. "No!" Theo shrieked, and with a surge of strength he could not have guessed he had, struggled to his feet. He had no time to mourn Applecore's sacrifice. The Ira was most of the way up the slope, still headed right for him. Even Hellebore had noticed it now. One of the constables turned and set his hornet gun against his shoulder, then fired. The whining roar of the gun sawed across the hillside. The undead thing's arm whipped back and then fluttered forward, rags of it now stripped away, but it kept trudging grimly upward. It wants only the one it was summoned for, shouted Hellebore. He wiped at the blood on his cheek, smearing it across his snow-pale skin. He turned and saw, to his satisfaction, that the terrible child was still actively immersed in the storm of lavender light, still singing and laughing obliviously, still climbing toward conclusion. "Let it have him," Hellebore directed the guards. "They are hard to kill, those things." You are thick. Vilmos, you really are. Plunged back into reality again, Theo was full of desperation and shame. Just like she always said. Applecore had sacrificed her life for this moment, for his freedom, and it was vanishing. He threw himself against the rigid resistance of his own sinews, fighting to move away from the spot where he was held. Hellebore was distracted, still dabbing at his cheek and staring at the thing coming up the slope, but the fairy lord was no longer fighting. Theo could feel the power of Hellebore's will stretch, but hold, keeping Theo's feet planted, leaving him helpless. The Era opened its arms, one of them green-brown with putrefaction, the other wet and tattered, shredded to ribbons by the constable's guns, an embrace without human feeling, only hunger to complete its task. Theo turned away from the relentless horror, not wanting to see that face as it closed on him. His hand climbed to the chain around his neck, Poppy's chain, and clutched it. So many had given so much, risked so much for him, but in the end it had not been enough. He looked out to the lake, the water dark now, only silvered a little by the light from the island's center. All ending now, he thought. The water. He had no more than a few seconds left to act. With an effort that felt as though it tore every nerve in his body loose from its sheath, he tried one last time to throw himself sideways away from the advancing creature. Scalding pain splashed through him, made him scream until it felt like his lungs were going to come out of his throat, but it was not enough to move his feet. It was enough, however, just barely enough to tip him sideways. For a moment, Theo felt the supremely weird sensation of his overmatched muscles trying, independently of his own will, to do the impossible, to keep his body upright when it was already falling. Then he thumped onto his side and began to roll down the sloping hillside toward the lake. He reached the bottom and teetered there for a moment on a low hummock at the water's edge, everything depending on the minutiae of balance. Then his legs went over, and the rest of him was tugged behind them, sliding into the cold gray water. He bobbed up to the surface, in control of his own exhausted body once more. The water was so shallow that even on his knees he was still only half submerged. "Ha!" said Lord Hellebore. "You are stronger than I suspected. But it was pointless, wasn't it? Better to give in gracefully. I do not think a cubit of water is going to keep you out of the hands of your nemesis." Everything seemed to pause. The terrible child still busy in the center of his glow, almost hidden now by its stunning brightness. Hellebore and the others watching the confrontation between Theo and the dead thing. Even the Era itself seemed surprised into immobility for a few seconds. Then it simply turned and came lurching down the slope toward him, as though someone had switched it back on. Theo felt something vast and cold touch him. He looked down and saw two arms, pale almost to the point of translucence, encircle him like bars of iron. Felt himself pulled back against wet fabric and a hard, flat breast as chill as ice. "No, nothing else will have him. He is mine." The voice resounded in his ear, ancient, slow. "He wears our shackle on his arm. He was freed to ransom himself, but I smell no gold, no bright jewels for my hair, so now he is reclaimed. Theo could only crouch in the belly-high water, held in her unbreakable, clammy grip. Her wet hair lay across his shoulders like seaweed. He did not turn, knew that if he looked into her eyes, that would be the last thing he saw. "Please," he said, "not yet. Just a few moments more." "You have no right of plea or pardon," the ancient water nymph told him, but not harshly. "I know, but I want to see if I was right." He could feel cold radiating from her, filling him where he lay cradled against her freezing belly, could feel her slow, slow heartbeat. "A moment, then," she said. And as he watched, the Era halted and stood motionless on the hillside, just yards from Theo, but suddenly as blind to him as if he had ceased to exist. It slowly pivoted its ruined head from side to side, then turned to the place where Hellebore and his monstrous stepchild stood. It took a hesitant step toward them, then another. Hellebore watched with wide eyes. "Stop! You idiot thing, stop!" he shouted. But the Era did not stop. Hellebore moved out of its way, waving his arms, screaming, "Shoot it! Destroy it!" Several of the constables began to fire. Their guns hissed and snapped, and the bronze hornets leaped toward the thing and through it. Gobbets of rotting flesh flew into the air. Much of the Era's stolen face vanished in a spray of dead tissue, leaving hanging bone and a few teeth. But still, it trudged up the hill. Only then did Hellebore realize that the thing was not after him. With Theo now the rightful possession of the ancient water spirit, and out of the Era's circle of perception, it headed inexorably toward the only thing like him, his almost twin, the small boy luxuriating in the lavender glow of pure power at the lip of the hill. Hellebore screamed in rage as he dashed after the Era and was almost shot by his own guards before they saw him and stopped firing. The ogres sprang after their master, but too late. Hellebore leaped and caught the creature's leg even as it stretched out its arms toward the oblivious child. Rotted fabric tore away in Hellebore's fingers, and so did a long strip of putrid flesh. He lost his grip and tumbled backward. The dead thing waded into the purple gleam and wrapped its arms around the child, who began to writhe and murmur like someone shaken out of a beautiful dream. Simultaneously, the light changed color, blooming scarlet and orange, or so it appeared at first. It was a moment before Theo, watching from the nymph's cold embrace, could be certain of what had happened. The Era had opened a gateway, like the one that had brought Theo to Fairy, but this gateway led straight into a raging inferno. The blaze that had been the warehouse of the remover of inconvenient obstacles. "It is compelled to do only one thing," Eamon Dowd had told him as they stood in that place, "to seize you and bring you here." Dowd was gone, but it seemed the Era's compulsion was not. The terrible child awoke to full reality only as the thing stepped through the gateway. He began to scream, a heart-rending screech of horror that could have been any child's. The boy's flesh was already smoking, the little body struggling helplessly in the grip of its burning captor as the doorway in reality closed again. Straight to hell, Theo thought, just like in the old stories. Then, for an instant, the severed connection between them returned. Just a brief touch, but even that merest hint of what the child was feeling made Theo scream and convulse in the unbending arms of his captor. Nidris Hellebore had only time for a single shout of rage before the billowing purple light, uncontrolled in the wake of the terrible child's vanishing, or perhaps returned to the control of those who had reason to hate him, suddenly enfolded the fairy lord. Hellebore squealed as the very bones inside his flesh turned white hot and began to burn their way out of his body, howled as light burst from his joints, his belly, his eyes, and mouth, then fell silent and collapsed in on himself, although small sounds still came out of the smoking mass. As the light from the pit expanded outward, growing weaker as it spread, the others ran away down the hill in heedless terror, scattering in all directions like startled pigeons. A chill hand covered Theo's eyes. "Enough," said the strong old voice, and the nymph pulled him down. As the hand that had temporarily blinded him lifted free, Theo saw green depths rushing up to meet him, incalculable depths. So that was it. That was a life. The thoughts were like bubbles, rising and popping. "Good night, nobody. Say good night." Then the water flooded into his startled open mouth, and blackness rushed in behind it. Part 5, Fairy Tale Ending. Chapter 42, Farewell Feast. In his dream, he floated in thick, cool space, surrounded by streamers of green movement. In fact, almost everything was green. The light, the shadows, his own hands where they drifted slowly in front of his face, stained a sickly color like old lunch meat. Fish, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, floated amid the rising bubbles, just as he himself was floating, watching him with more curiosity in their glassy eyes than seemed decent. Sometimes the green went away completely, swallowed by darkness, and when it came back, he was surrounded by women instead of fish, all of them lovely in a strange sort of way, hair furling and waving, moved by invisible currents. These women watched him as the fish had watched him, smiling. Some of them seemed to have very sharp teeth, and whispering among themselves. Through it all, though, through the green light that came and went, he was aware of nothing about himself except weightlessness and a feeling of unconcern that seemed to make his thoughts as buoyant as his slowly kicking legs. Only occasionally did it occur to him that he should be drowning, or might even already have done so. He had been staring at her for a while before he realized her black hair was not drifting, but instead hung down beside her pale, pretty face in what once would have seemed a perfectly ordinary manner. He stared a while longer before he realized he recognized her, although something about her was different, and her name was slow in coming. "His eyes are open," the dark-haired young woman said. "I think he's waking up." Another face, this one less familiar, leaned in. "It is sooner than we would have guessed, but he has a strong constitution, good breeding." "Don't say that," the young woman said. "I hate that." "Poppy?" He had the name now, although some of the details were still wrong. His vision remained cloudy, as though he had not entirely left the lake bottom. She seemed to have lost her eyebrows. No, he realized they were there, but they were so pale as to be almost invisible. It gave her a strangely Japanese look, the face a white oval, like a geisha's. One thing was certain, though. Just seeing her made him feel good. "Poppy? Is that... am I?" "You're fine, Theo. You're alive." She suddenly climbed up on whatever supported him. It had a certain give, and he momentarily feared tumbling back down into whatever green depths he had escaped. And she kissed his face. She hugged him, and he let out a little huff of pain. "Oh, sorry. I think... did I break a rib?" He was trying to make sense of his surroundings. A tent? Whatever it was, the only light came from one of the glowing witch-light spheres. The other fairy woman had gone somewhere. He could just make out the light of what might be a doorway, but he couldn't lift his head high enough to be certain. What else did I do? I can hardly move. Everything hurts. No one's quite sure. You were bruised all over, but by the time we saw you, they were all old bruises. The Duchess treated you well down there. Duchess? His head was quite remarkably empty of any useful memories, although it felt very full of something else, swollen and aching. The one who had you, the nymph. Oh, Theo, I thought we'd never get you back. She had a tight grip on him again, and he found that the pleasure of it was such that he could even ignore the pain in his side. What happened? He was starting to remember a little of it now, and the dominant image was a column of billowing lavender light and the terrible shrieking of Hellebore? Lord Hellebore. He's dead. And that child thing, too. He looked up, worried by her expression. They are dead, aren't they? They have to be. But doesn't that mean we won? But the memory of Applecore's last brave moments had returned, and winning suddenly didn't mean as much as it should have. Did we win? She shrugged. Yes, I suppose. Everything is a mess, but it's a lot better than it would have been. A noise distracted her, and she looked up toward the doorway. There are people here to see you. They've been waiting as long as I have, hoping that Primrose could make a bargain. Primrose? Bargain? Wait, you'll find out everything, and I'll be right here with you. What happened to your eyebrows? What do you mean? But she knew. Oh, the color. It's nothing. They were always white like this. I decided to stop dyeing them, that's all. To stop pretending I wasn't a thorn apple. Ah. He lifted a hand to touch the pale white stripes, although it seemed a long distance to reach. She took the hand before it reached her face and held it, as though it might hurt her to be touched there. You do still care about me, don't you, Theo? No, that's not fair to ask you that right now. Just try to leave and you'll find out how I feel. He gave her hand the strongest, most reassuring squeeze he could muster, which, in his present state, he guessed was something like being humped by a very old starfish. But for all his growing joy at realizing that by some mysterious means he was back in the world again, and that Poppy was in it and waiting for him, there was a hole inside him that could not be so easily filled. Oh, Applecore, he said quietly, speaking to a ghost, a memory. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Sorry for what? Someone said. Being a great hulking idiot? That's not entirely your fault now, is it? Cumber Sedge was sitting on the foot of the bed, and unless he had become an amazing ventriloquist, the tiny shape sitting on his shoulder had to be. Applecore? Theo tried to sit up, but couldn't manage it. You're not dead. And neither are you, you daft thing, but not for lack of trying. She stood, and Cumber picked her up and set her carefully on Theo's chest. She was paler than usual, with pronounced dark rings under her eyes and some healing burns on her face and even on parts of her head, as displayed by her very closely cropped hair. But otherwise she seemed to have all her limbs and her old personality intact. What are you staring at? Have you never seen a good-looking woman before? Not one I'm as surprised to see. And Cumber. Thank God, sorry, thank the trees or whatever. Didn't mean to make you flinch. We all made it. We're alive. Cumber nodded slowly. His smile, too, took a while to come. We are. Not everyone was so lucky. There are many deaths in the city before the end. Zair's junk will, among others, and hundreds upon hundreds more. In fact, Cyrus died trying to save you. I'm sorry to hear that. He was nice to me, nicer than almost anybody else of his kind, but what do you mean trying to save me? He and a bunch of folk from the flower houses, fighting against Hellebore's lot, were following all of you, Applecore said. The goblins helped them track you, but it gets very hard in the center of midnight. I found them in the woods trying to get to the lake, but I knew they wouldn't make it in time. That's why I came back by myself. Then when they did get there, the rest of the constables and Foxglove and Poppy's father. Sorry, Poppy. Nothing to apologize for, Poppy said, but her expression had gone stiff and cold. Well, they fought back, even though Lord Hellebore was dead. Lord Foxglove was killed, and some of the guards and Poppy's father was wounded, but Cyrus and several of his troops were killed, too. Applecore sighed. Anton Hellebore threw himself into the well instead of letting himself be captured. The pig. At least they say it took him a long time to die. And of course, thousands were killed in the city. And there were terrible fires, even after the dragons died. So nobody's felt much like celebrating these last few weeks. It took a moment. Few weeks. Theo tried to sit up, but couldn't. Where? Have I been unconscious all that time? Perhaps. Cumber, too, had more than a few healing scars, but there was something else about him that was also different. A gravity he had not possessed before. He's a survivor, Theo suddenly realized. If he were immortal, I'd say he's grown up now. We don't really know what you went through. You were under the water, you see. Under the water? Yeah, I suppose I knew that. Even remember it a little, but how did I get back here again? Wherever here is. We're in the camp at the old 5-foot bridge, Cumber said. Button's tent city has become sort of temporary headquarters for the reorganization, I guess you'd call it. You see, the Parliament of Blooms is scattered. A lot of them dead and retreated to their country estates, so there's no one in charge here, really. Also, the big power plants aren't working anymore, and New Mound House is just a mass of smoke and rubble, so this seemed as good a place as any. We never had much generated power to work with out here anyway. And pretty much everybody knows now that this is where it all started, so they're showing up here from all over Fairy, asking to help, that or trying to get a piece of whatever's coming next. But I still don't know why I'm not living with the water nymphs or whatever they were. How did I get out again? We should let Primrose tell that story, Cumber began. I think he'll be coming to see you later. I have come now, declared a new voice. This time, Theo found he could lift himself enough to see the tall shape silhouetted by daylight in the doorway of his tent. This is like the end of The Wizard of Oz, Theo said. You know, I had a dream, and you were in it, and you. Primrose shook his head. I do not understand your reference, but this is certainly no dream. I, too, have been waiting to speak to you, Theo Vilmos. Well, would you prefer to be known as Septimus Violet now? I think it's too late for me to change names. At least the Theo part. Speaking of which, you must be Lord Primrose now. Primrose came closer. I do not know. We may find that in the new world coming, there are no longer lords and ladies. The goblins will have much to say about that, and others, too. Goblins? How is Button? Did he survive? Jesus, was he smart about everything? Primrose hesitated for a moment. Yes, he is alive. He is well. He has asked to see you later. In the meantime, I will tell you my part of the story, although it is largely uninteresting. Even the bargain I made for your freedom. The nymphs, like everyone else, are interested in having a stake in the changes that are to come. I offered them my help, and they agreed, more or less. More or less? It is nothing for you to concern yourself with. You are free of your nymph binding. That is what matters. Theo could not help staring at the band of river grass that encircled Primrose's wrist. Yes, well, Caradmus Primrose shrugged. I suspect that, even with the world upside down, enough of my family fortune remains intact. I will be able to ransom myself before spring comes, and I have the urge to swim in any ponds or lakes. I owed you a debt of honor, Theo. I nearly killed you, after all. You didn't owe me anything. Actually, I think it's me who owes you something now. Some information. The memory had been nagging at him since Primrose had appeared. The thought of Eamon Dowd's crimes made him feel a bit queasy, but he had no right to keep them secret. He reached for Poppy's hand, found it, and squeezed again. She reached across and spread her fingers on his chest as Theo turned back to Caradmus Primrose. I have to tell you about what happened to your sister. But how could you know? Primrose asked, surprise creasing his forehead. No. Know what? That she is dead. Her heart failed. For a moment, even the Flower Lord could not hide what was inside him. But then he composed himself again. It is for the best, I suppose. It was just before we struck back at Helbor, before the dragons came down on the city. Her nurses say that for a moment she was herself again, but so frightened they could not comfort her. Then she died. I saw her. She looked as though she was at peace at the last. Theo swallowed. Let me tell you what I know. In fact, since Cumber was out cold for most of what I heard, there are probably things in all this that none of you know yet. It was hard to tell when an already grim fairy had become more so, but that certainly seemed to be the case with Primrose. As Theo finished his explanation, the new master of Primrose House rose and bowed. I salute you again for your bravery and your honesty. These tidings do not ease my heart much, I must confess. My sister suffered long and terribly, and must have suffered even at the end, when Dowd's spell was broken by his death and her wounded mind returned to its body. But it is better to know, I think, than to be ignorant. Still, after I pass the most important pieces of news along to Button, I will be alone for a while. I'm sorry for what he did to your family, even if he wasn't my real great-uncle. Theo shook his head. I liked him, at least from his notebook. It's hard to believe it was the same person. We enter a perilous country when we decide that because we mean well, or because we are largely good, that we are thus allowed to do something we know is wrong. The fairy paused in the doorway. Oh, and Theo, Button would very much like you to come to him in the bridge house this evening. Primrose lifted a hand, his face somber, and walked out of the tent. I should go too, Cumber said. For now, I'm nearly the only Farisher here that any of the powerful parties actually know. And decisions are being made in small groups and at surprise meetings that will be laws one day. May even be the stuff of learned books. You would find it most interesting, Theo. You'll be in more than a few pages of those books yourself, by the way. We're building a new ferry from the ground up. When I can actually sit up without puking, I'd love to hear about it. Don't know how big I am on meetings, though. It is your future being planned, too, Cumber suddenly flushed. Oh, I forgot. You'll be going back to your world. If it's still there, I guess I will, Theo said. Did we stop the terrible child in time? Cumber smiled. We think so. What scientific tests we've been able to do suggest that your world continues, much as it always has, no better and no worse. Theo noticed that Poppy had suddenly let go of his hand and was staring steadily at the fabric of the tent wall. Poppy? Cumber cleared his throat. As I said, I should be going. Cor, can I carry you someplace, or would you like to stay and talk to Theo and Poppy a bit longer? Cor? Theo saw that Cumber was blushing again. Hold on, are you two, like, an item? Applecore gave him her most baleful stare. Maybe. And what business is it of yours, boyo? You seem to have been keeping yourself occupied. Her face softened. Meaning no offense, Mistress Thornapple. You make a cute couple. None taken, Poppy said, but there was not much life in it. But Theo stared at Applecore, then at Cumber Sedge. I still don't get it. I mean, how would... Once the hospitals are quite so busy, one of us will probably have the operation, Cumber said, and now the blush was lighting him up like a neon sign. I mean, me, probably. It's a lot easier to go large to small. Large to... Theo couldn't quite wrap his head around it, but he could tell it wasn't going to get any less weird, no matter how hard he tried. Whatever. I wish you both well. He paused for a moment. That doesn't sound right, but I mean it. You're two of my best friends in the whole world. In any world. That's all I can say. I hope you'll be so happy together you wake up every day singing. Thanks. Cumber could not quite meet Theo's eye, but he was grinning. Pick me up, Theo, said Applecore, waving her hand at him. Come on. I want to tell you something private, like. He had already put his hand down for her to step into before it hit him. Why aren't you flying? She looked at him in surprise. Then her face twisted into a sadness that he now realized had been beneath the surface all along. Oh, of course, you don't know, poor thing. You've been down with that soggy lot at the bottom of the lake. She hesitated a moment, then turned her back toward him and carefully pulled the top of her dress down over her shoulders, edging it lower until he could see the blackened stumps where her wings had been. Oh, Applecore! His eyes filled with tears. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I'm not dead, Theo, and that's what counts. If Hellebore had pointed that finger a few inches to the side, I would have been, so I was bloody lucky. She made herself smile. Besides, it gives me and Cumber something else in common, besides what we already have, both being intellectual types and both having a lot of practice at putting up with arsehole you. He laughed, even though he knew she meant him to, that she was only trying to get out from under his pity. Oh, you didn't lose your charm either, or your ladylike demeanor. Ah, and you can shag yourself twice. You better watch your lip. Dolly the ogre's coming out soon for a visit, and she still owes you a good thumping. Now lift me up. Told you I want to say something quiet like. When he had raised her to his ear, she whispered, Go easy on her, Theo, the Thornapple girl. For some reason, no normal person can understand, she really cares about you. Also, she's going to have to help decide whether her father gets put to death or just imprisoned for the rest of his life. And remember, we fairy folk have long lives. Whether or not she hates him, that can't be much fun. And one last thing, I was so afraid for you, and I'm just blindingly glad. I'm just blindingly glad you're not dead. But tell anyone I said, and you will be. When Cumber had carried her out, Applecore effected a ladylike farewell wave as they went through the tent door, like someone at the first class rail of a departing luxury liner. Theo turned to Poppy. Applecore told me about your father. That's bad. They shouldn't make you help decide. She turned on him, surprisingly angry. Yes, they should. Of course they should. Because I'm part of it. The old way. I'm the daughter of one of the men who destroyed Daffodil House, who murdered all those people and helped start a flower war that destroyed half the city and plunged civilization back into the Forest Age. They need to see where I stand, so they know whether I need to be imprisoned too. Well, I suppose it's more likely they'd just exile me, since I have people like Primrose and Cumber to speak for me. Anyway, it's perfectly reasonable. She softened a little, but still looked weary and unhappy. But if that's not what's bothering you, what do you think is bothering me? You're going back to the mortal world, Theo. I heard you. The adventure is over, and you're going to hop the first gateway back. That's fine. You have every right. You've suffered terrible things in a world that wasn't really yours, for something that wasn't your fault, only the accident of your birth. But you can't expect me to be very happy about it. She stood, dry-eyed and angry. I have to go now. I've been here all day, and I have other things to do. Just before she reached the door of the tent, Theo found his voice. Poppy? Poppy, wait. What? Come back, please. He patted the bed. Sit. She did, like a cat with its fur up. First off, here. This is yours. It hurt to raise his arms, but he slipped the chain over his head and held it out to her. Your mother's family moundstone, I think you said it was. I gave it to you. And it gave me strength when things were really dark, but it's yours, Poppy. Something important from someone else who loved you. Take it. He closed her fingers around it. Fine. I'll be going then. He held her arm when she tried to stand, but was too weak to hold her. Hey, maybe I do want to go back home. But did I ever say I wanted to go back without you? She looked at him suspiciously. What does that mean? What it sounds like. You're angry because you think I'm going back to the world where I grew up. Maybe I will. But why are you so certain I won't ask you to go with me? She frowned, but it was mainly to cover confusion and a hitch of sudden hope. Why are you so certain I have my Clover Effect exemption? That I haven't already been there? Have you? No, as it happens, I haven't. But why would I want to go to your world anyway? To get old and die, probably on my own after you leave me? Anyway, there are plenty of grown-up women in the mortal world who would be better matches for you. Women who know the things you know, the songs, the places, the names. He laughed. Grown-up women? Good God, don't you know you've been around long enough to be my great-grandmother? Now you're just making fun. Maybe I am. Maybe I'm not. Look, Poppy, you have to remember, I just woke up, and the world I hadn't really figured out in the first place, is suddenly completely different. I'm trying to sort it all out. I can't even guess at half the things that have happened since it all went down. Come on, give me a chance. He extended his hand. At last she took it, then allowed herself to be drawn back onto the edge of the bed. I do know I want to be with you, wherever we might wind up. You and me, Poppy. I want to try this thing out, this thing we've started. I don't pretend to know how love works, and I don't know much about these mortal and immortal relationships. Well, immortal who thinks he's immortal, and another immortal who thinks she's too young for him, to be more exact. But give us a chance to figure it out together, will you? Truly, Theo? I hate pity. I'd kill you before I'd let you pity me. And with her thornapple mask in place, she looked like she meant it. Truly. She stared at him hard. Not the thornapple mask now, but not a lot warmer and fuzzier than that either, and then seemed to make up her mind. She let go of his hand, but only long enough to climb into bed beside him and wrap her legs and arms around him. She put her warm mouth against his ear. "Okay, so how weak are you?" she asked. "Really weak? Or just enough that you'll need a long nap afterward?" Let's see how much we've got left. I think if we run past, we might be able to finish. We're going to run past, though, so I will warn you ahead of time. We're going to probably go about 10 minutes or so past the hour. He woke up at the sound of Cumber's discreet cough outside the tent. Theo got up, aching and wobbly-headed, but more or less functional, and dressed by the light of the globe in the clean clothes that had been put out for him, a kind of white tunic and pants that to his eye looked something like the dress uniform from a karate academy. He pulled on the feather-light boots, then kissed Poppy on the cheek and left her to sleep. "Took you long enough?" said Applecore, sitting on Cumber's shoulder. Theo fought an undeniable moment of jealousy at seeing her in her favorite position, but on someone else. "I'm not moving very fast." He looked around at the riverside camp, bright with campfires as a carnival midway. "So we're going to see Button?" "You are." Cumber seemed depressed, but with a Farisher it was a bit hard to tell. "It's an honor. Button isn't seeing very many people tonight." Theo nodded. "Let's walk then. I'm pretty hungry. And maybe you can tell me a bit more on the way about what happened while I was floating around at the bottom of the lake." He said it lightly, but it was in him still, the languor and green silence, like a dream from which he couldn't quite wake up. "The whole thing, the battle, I still don't quite get it. I know about how we helped Button bring those Grimms into the city, and I'm guessing they killed the dragons, but still..." He looked up, a little startled, as a gang of gnome-like creatures sitting around one of the fires called to him by name, wishing him a fine evening. Other passers-by seemed to recognize him too, smiling shyly or even giving him a kind of salute. "What's with these people? What did you tell them, Cumber?" "The truth, Theo. That without you it all would have failed. Cyrus Jonquil and his troops would have been too late, and definitely too little to stop Hellebore. He and his monster child would have been in control of a power as great as that of the king and queen themselves. Greater, perhaps. But even so, even with the Grimms, Hellebore and the others had all those soldiers, the parliamentary constables with their bee-guns or whatever, guards, armies. Even with the dragons dead, how is it that one of the other parliament bigwigs didn't just take over?" Cumber walked on for a way, without speaking. "I heard Lord Hollyhock speak once, at a symposium at Daffodil House," he said at last. "Lady Amelia brought me along as her secretary. You remember Hollyhock, don't you, Theo? He was a good man, very smart. Anyway, I heard him say that the Flower Lords were sitting on top of the people of Fairy and thought they were riding the population as though it were a horse, but it was more like an unbroken dragon. There would come a point, Hollyhock said, that if the Flower Lords didn't mend their ways, the beast beneath them would realize how strong it was and would simply shake them off and crush them. That's what happened. Button's revolution, if you want to call it that, made everyone aware that things could change. You see, not only the goblins were angry, but thousands of people must have died. Not as many as you'd think. Hundreds in the first hours, when the constables still believed they were simply quelling a riot. But when the dragons fell, and the people came out into the streets in real numbers, well, you have to understand that most of the constables aren't flower nobility. They're just ordinary fairy folk, not that different from Cor or me. If you're a century-old she, fresh out of the Hawthorne suburbs, it's one thing to shoot at troublemakers who are trying to brain you with rocks or set you on fire with scattershot flame charms, but another thing entirely to mow down ordinary men and women and even children, your own people, who are standing in front of you, refusing to do what they're told. Especially when you know, as many of the constables must have, that they are right and the people you serve are wrong. But if the flower lords are out, who's going to take over? Who's in charge? That's the question, all right, boyo, said Applecore. Cumber shrugged. Nobody knows, and that's why these are such important days. Come look at something, Theo. They had reached the edge of the bridge, and now Cumber led him up the spiral of stairs from the riverside. A pair of goblins with spears, Theo could not tell if they were Grimms or simply armed that way, stopped them at the top for a moment's quick examination, then waved them past onto the bridge. Come over here. Cumber beckoned him to the edge of the bridge. It took a moment, peering out into the night, for Theo to realize that the great haphazard mass of dim lights before him was the city. It looked so different, like a dying campfire or something. Troops, under control of the new council. It's fairies of all sorts now, goblins, even ferishers, working together, at least for the moment, have been sent to free all the slaves from the power plants, to close the places and lock them. There's no longer any power in the city that a person cannot make for himself or herself, Cumber explained. Those are fires, candles, lanterns, a few radiance charms, but most people are saving their strength for what's more important, making sure their families are fed and protected. The downtown area is dark, the building's empty. It's a new world, and nobody knows what kind of world yet. The last time Theo had seen the city, it had glowed like the display in a jewelry store window, diamond and ruby and sapphire gleams dazzlingly bright. Now it looked like all the gems had been replaced with amber and topaz, an ancient light, murky and mysterious, but somehow also satisfying. You said the king and queen are gone. Vanished from the ruins of the cathedral on the old mound. They might be dead, really dead this time, but I doubt that could be true. Perhaps they simply moved on, changed. Nobody knows. I suspect there'll be whole university departments trying to answer these questions for centuries. He took Theo's arm and led him along the bridge. Cumber had changed. He had something now, a sort of reserve, an inner weight that made the rest of his traits seem to fit better. Now, go on, the Ferrisher said, pointing to the bridge house. Button's waiting to see you. Pick me up for a minute, Theo, commanded Applecore. When Theo had her safe, Cumber Sedge retreated a few steps to give them a little privacy. Are you happy? Theo asked her. With Cumber? Oh, he's a fine lad, gentle and sweet as spring rain, a bit on the quiet side sometimes, but I've got enough to say for both of us. She looked at him, her little face owlish in the torchlight. Don't worry about me, Theo. Yes, I'm happy. And whatever you do, I think you'll be happy too. I just wanted to say, well, I'm proud of you. You're not anywhere near as much of an agent as I suspected. He laughed. I'd like that in writing. Applecore snorted. Like any of your other friends can read. She stood on tiptoe, balancing herself with a hand on his jaw, and kissed him at the corner of his mouth, a touch as light and cool as a snowflake just before it melts. If you don't come back to us, we won't forget you. And I'm not talking about Cumber's history book nonsense either. I'm talking about the ones who care about you. Like you? Yeah, like me. He lifted her up and kissed the top of her head as gently as he could. I haven't had many real friends, you know. Could be her breath. She was scowling, but he knew better. Now, give me back to my boyfriend before he decides to come over and hit you with a grimoire or something. He had expected to be met at the top of the stairs by Button's ogre bodyguards, but there was no sign of them. He was met instead by a trio of goblins he didn't recognize, all dressed in loose, colorful clothing, with knives stuck in their belts and various lines painted or tattooed on their faces. They did not seem delighted to see him, but there was no hostility either. They bowed in a stiffly formal way, arms at their sides, and then led him into Button's apartment. A group of goblin musicians sat cross-legged in one corner, playing a soft but angular melody. And for a moment Theo was thrown back into that hour when the music was all that had saved him. Might it have saved more than that? Could goblin jazz have spared the entire mortal world from ruin? What a concept, he thought. An overblown rock opera if ever there was one. One of the instrumentalists nodded as Theo passed. It was Bottlecap, with whom he had shared a night of music and ghostweed, but the hush of the room and the air of ceremony kept him from stopping to converse. Still, Theo thought it would be interesting to talk to him about what had happened on the little island, even to try to work out in actual music some of what he had experienced. Maybe someday. Yeah, but I'll be going home, so that won't happen. Theo had also anticipated that Primrose and some of Button's other closest confidants would be there, but other than himself, there were only goblins. He saw Doorlatch and a few others that he recognized from the camp, but there were far more unfamiliar faces, serious, wild-looking goblins in festival colors, many of them armed. At the center of the room, in front of a carpet laid with dishes and tea bowls, sat Mud-Bug Button. He was dressed in white, as Theo was. He looked like an Indian holy man holding court in his ashram. He stood as Theo approached, reaching out to him with a taloned hand. "Welcome, Theo Vilmos. It is good of you to come. I had feared you would not be well enough, and that this would be a poor farewell feast without the most important guest. But, well, to be honest, I'm not 100% certain I'm going back." "Ah." Button sat down and directed one of the goblins next to him to pour tea for Theo. The person in question looked more like a warrior than a servant, but he did as he was asked. When Theo had taken a few sips for courtesy's sake and allowed his dish to be piled with various savories, he had a quick, if covert look to make sure none of them were field mouse based. He leaned forward. "Where are Primrose and the others?" "Caradinus is in mourning," Button explained. "He begged to be excused." "He must have loved his sister very much." Button looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Yes, he did." Theo said, "I'm amazed to be alive. I'm surprised so many of us are. Did you know it would work this way?" For the first time, Button showed a little of his old, sly self. "If I told you I did, would you promise to tell that story to all who ask you? Then history would remember me as a genius of tactics, another Lord Rose. But, to be truthful, no. I hoped. Primrose and I made the best plan we could. We knew the goblins would fight after the stick was broken, that my people's anger was too hot to be contained once the treaty was ended. But did we know for certain that others would come out, that the streets would be full of discontent and rage? No. We could only do what was best and hope." "But you did know that Grimms could kill dragons?" Again Button smiled. "I knew that they could, yes. But even that was what might be called a gamble. And everyone knows that although we goblins love gambling, we are not always good at it." He turned to the goblin on his left, whose costume bristled with feathers and beadwork jewelry. "Otter, when you lived in the hills, you killed a dragon, yes?" The goblin looked at Theo, then rubbed his long nose. "Yes, my people called me Wormslayer." "How big was it?" Button asked. The one called Otter thought for a moment, then spread his arms wide. "Wings like this," he said. "One of the big ones." He went back to his solemn chewing. "That would mean Otter's famous trophy was about 10 or 12 feet long." Button laughed. "So, you see, even the Grimms had little experience with the great worms. Again, we could only hope that arrows steeped in poison in their eyes and soft throats would have the same effect that they did on the monster's much smaller cousins." My God, they were trying that for the first time? War is often that way, said Button. Now eat. I would ask you more questions about what you heard and saw, what happened to you, particularly of the remover. The little I have heard is very surprising. But you're not eating. I am fasting, the goblin explained. But the food is very good. Eat. You have been a long time asleep, and I think you need it. Theo really was very hungry, and although many of the tastes were unfamiliar, the food was good. As he answered Button's questions, struggling to remember the order in which things had happened, having to backtrack several times when he realized he had left out an important detail, he realized that goblin food and goblin music, just to name two unquestionably foreign things, were beginning to seem almost ordinary to him. So, you yourself were the key, Button said at last. Just a tool. No, that was Helibor's great error. He thought of you that way, but it was your mind and your heart that broke him. Now I will ask you a question, just as you asked me. Did you know that the era would take the child if it could not take you? Theo shrugged. Like you said yourself, I hoped. I didn't have much time to think about it, really. I just remembered Dowd saying something about how a changeling and the mortal child he gets switched with have some kind of bond. I didn't really understand it, but there weren't a lot of other options. Also, I suddenly realized that I'd rather have one of those water women get me than that thing. It would have been a quick death by fire or a slow death beneath the water, Button said thoughtfully. They say that those taken by water spirits come to love their captors before they die. He went silent for a moment and then shook his head. There has been too much talk about death. Tell me more about your world. This is a feast, after all. I have been too much in the company of my own people lately, however much I love them. Tell me tales of your world, which has so recently escaped a terrible fate that it likely did not even know existed. I hope so. I hate to go back and find myself in the middle of the new Dark Ages or something. Theo paused. Just one more question for you, if you don't mind. Something I still don't understand. You said the goblins were ready to fight back, and it seems like the only thing keeping them under the thumb of the Flower Lords was that treaty stick. Why hadn't anyone broken it before? Why were you the first? Button gave him a quizzical look. Do you really want another goblin tale? Very well. I cannot refuse you tonight. I will try to make it a swift one. The answer is deceptively simple, Theo. First of all, most goblins did not know where the stick was kept. We supposed it would be hidden in some deep and well-guarded vault. It did not occur to us that the Flower Lords knew so little about us or cared so little for the danger we posed to them, that they did not understand only our sacred word bound us to them, our ancestors' promise, in the form of the treaty stick. Primrose himself told me where it was. It was merely a curiosity to him, something he had stumbled across in the dusty back rooms of the Parliamentary Museum as he pursued his studies in justice and history. When he mentioned it to me years after he had seen it, I realized exactly what it was and began to plan. But somebody must have known. There must have been goblin janitors or somebody. Why didn't anyone ever take it before? Why were you the one who broke it? Button was silent for a moment. I suppose it is a bit shameful, in a way, that no one before me dared to do this thing. Yes, there may have been some that knew, but it was also true that no one wanted to face the death that would result from breaking that treaty. Theo didn't understand. The goblins seemed a bit more gung-ho than that. It was hard to imagine them enduring servitude, merely out of fear that many of them would die in a rebellion. He would never forget the wild warriors he had seen in Strawflower Square, calmly stringing their bows as the flailing black shadows came down on them from the sky. "Enough of this," Button said suddenly. "I invoke my privilege as guest of honor. Tell me the tales of your world, Theo. Tell me of your life. Make me laugh." "I'll do my best." He shrugged off the thoughts of war and worms, tried to think of the things he missed about the world to which it seemed he would soon be returning. He wondered if Button would understand why Johnny Battistini, trying to parallel park a stolen ice cream wagon while ripped out of his mind on mushrooms, was funny. He told him the story. Button understood, or seemed to. It seemed to be nearly midnight when he finally got up to say goodbye. Button also rose and hugged him, a strange, wiry embrace that was not quite like anything Theo had experienced. "I will miss you, Theo. It has been good to know you." "Well, don't change my address in your Rolodex quite yet. I'm still thinking it over." "Ah." Button took his hand for a moment, fixed him with those slotted yellow eyes. "I feel sure that whatever you do, you will take a little goblin music with you always." He let go of Theo's hand. "Go safely, Theo Vilmos." "I like that better than what you said to me the last time we were together. What was that? Something like, we aren't promised anything but the last breath we took." "Something like, yes. Good night." No one was waiting for him outside the bridge house. Cumber and Applecore long since gone off to bed. And that was a personal arrangement Theo still hadn't completely wrapped his head around, but there were enough fires and torches burning in the riverside camp, not to mention the flaring stars to make finding his way back easy. Something nagged at him as he walked, something about the way Button had spoken, the things he had said, or on any other such night, Theo would have let it go, but he was stone sober, having drunk nothing but goblin tea, and it was either that or think about his own still very muddled plans. "I'm not a mortal, but I think like one. So where do I belong? And if I don't go home to the mortal world, will they take back the farewell feast?" He was full of questions and found himself almost nostalgic for the old days, for the happy ignorance of going home blasted and blank. Here's another one. Why did Button throw a farewell get-together for me and invite a bunch of wild goblins I don't know? Perhaps it was only the goblin's odd, semi-formal way of speaking, but the theme had come up several times, including Button ending the conversation about the breaking of the treaty stick by invoking his privilege as guest of honor. But if that was a farewell feast for me, wouldn't I have been the guest of honor? And then it suddenly clicked. The whole strange way that things had gone. Everyone's reticence and odd remarks. It was a goblin story about the stick. He told me so. And goblin stories always have a hole in the middle. Button had said it himself, but Theo hadn't recognized it. No one wanted to face the death that would result from breaking that treaty. Those had been his exact words. Theo had assumed he meant the death of Button's fellow goblins in a rebellion, but he had been talking about himself. Those white robes. He hadn't been a holy man surrounded by acolytes, but a condemned prisoner, however respected, surrounded by his jailers, by his executioners. Theo ran back across the camp as fast as he could, but the bridge house was locked, the upper windows dark. He hammered his fists on the door, but no one answered. At last, old door latch came out of one of the other buildings on the ramshackle bridge, wiping his eyes, whether because he had been asleep or crying, Theo couldn't tell. When he at last understood Theo's heartbroken ramblings, he tried to lead him back to his tent. "There is nothing you can do," the goblin said. "Nothing. It is the law. Button knew that. He did what was best. He shall remain in us always, a great hero. Theo would not be comforted by this and would not go away quietly. It seemed like he had been tricked, although if anyone had fooled him, he had fooled himself. He felt cheated of a final chance to say goodbye. Dorlatch had to summon half a dozen helpers, goblins and fairy folk, and one ogre bodyguard that Theo didn't recognize, to carry him back forcibly to his tent and Poppy. The only thing he could think about, the only thing that made the pain the tiniest bit less agonizing, was that perhaps it had been easier for Button this way. One less weeping farewell, one less time having to listen to someone demanding the impossible. Poppy, the child of a cold culture and a cruel family, did not try to make things better. Poison was poison, she seemed to know, and had to be sweated out. She held Theo while he wept and groaned and shouted and kept on holding him until, exhausted, he was taken by sleep at last. Man, we still have pages. Okay, how many is that? 805. It's still like 11 pages. Okay, I'm afraid we're going to have to come back and finish that up next early Sunday morning. I keep underestimating how long that story is, but we're already at 8:20. So we've got one chapter left, but it's another 10 or 15 minutes. So we'll read that to start next week, and then we'll move on to something else, whatever that might be. I haven't decided yet, although I'm always open to suggestions. Thank you for bearing with me extra long. I am sorry I couldn't get it finished tonight. I'd be another 15 or 20 minutes. To be honest with you, I don't know if I have the strength. I need revivifying pizza and caffeine. But I'm very glad you stuck with me. I apologize I couldn't finish it. We've got one chapter left, and that's going to finish everything off, though. So I'll read it at the beginning of next time, have a brief conversation about the book itself, maybe, and then we'll start reading something else. Whatever it might be, I don't know yet. As I said, feel free to make suggestions. Anyway, with that, and a bit later than usual, I am now going to wrap it up. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you so much for your health and well-being and participation, because I value all those things. Take care of yourselves, take care of your loved ones, take care of your neighbors, take care of needy strangers, if you can do it, without getting kidnapped by a gang of Satanists or something. Not all needy strangers, obviously, should be treated like pets. But if somebody does need some help, try and give it to them. It's a tough time. Wonderful to have this forum to hang out with you. And with that in mind, I'll see you next Sunday, 2 a.m. Pacific time and 7 p.m. Pacific time. And until then, I send you all love and best wishes from the volcano lair in which my supervillain wife and supervillain self preside over our circus of madness. And I wish you all the very best. See you soon.